In this video, I would like to talk about one of the underappreciated GURPS books that probably should have had a different title, GURPS Psionic Campaigns. If you judge it by the title, this is a very specialized book about running campaigns with psionics. Even the introduction doesn't do a very good job explaining what you can find there. But if you buy the book and read or just browse through it, you'll see that it is much more generic than the title implies. If I were to come up with a better title, I wouldn't even do that, and just include everything from this book in GURPS powers, not GURPS psionic powers. So let's go through the chapters and see why this book is actually very useful for almost any campaign that features powers, not just psionic powers. The first chapter is titled What is Psi? It talks about various beliefs about psychic abilities, but I would like to highlight a box titled Old Time Psi. Remember the Psi power modifier? It has a value of -10% and consists of -5% for anti-powers and -5% for psychotronics. In low-tech games, psychotronics usually do not exist, so you have to replace it with something else. Some of the suggestions for the replacement were incorporated in the Dungeon Fantasy psionics, but what I like here the most is psychobotanics, a low-tech equivalent of psychotronics in the form of natural preparations. I suggest using the psionic drugs from GURPS Psi-Tech for that, and allowing making them with a couple of naturalist rolls. I don't know if I have said this before, but psionic powers in GURPS are not very generic. They have a defined flavor and style. The Defining Psi chapter talks about this in more detail. The Psionic Potential chapter is an amazing food for thought. While the title says psionic, this is actually a very generic chapter that applies to all kinds of powers. Psionics, magic, divine powers, superpowers, etc. Who can get powers? Does your potential depend on genetics? Can it be trained? Does it have any physical representation? Does brain damage affect your powers? Can stress or shock trigger your latent abilities? Can you just learn or train your powers? If yes, do special institutions exist? This is all very good stuff. Representing Psi is yet another short but excellent chapter that is also generic. I feel that this is an important chapter that every GM who is running a game with powers should read, be they psionic powers, sorcery, or anything else. It describes 4 approaches to the powers framework. Closed list. All the powers available are defined and the GM creates all of the abilities available within those powers ahead of time. The players may only choose abilities from this list. This is something I advocate for sorcery, it makes things better, in my opinion, but it requires the GM to have some system mastery. Fuzzy abilities. All of the powers available are defined ahead of time by the GM, along with a list of appropriate advantages for each. This is how GURPS Powers describes powers. Open abilities. No abilities are defined in advance, the GM simply lists the powers. And open powers. The GM may let players invent whatever powers and abilities they want. All 4 approaches have their place and merit in different games, but I think that this is important advice that really should have been part of GURPS powers, not something hidden in a separate book. There is also the decisions box that GMs who run games with psionics really should read, because saying we are using GURPS psionic powers doesn't really answer all the questions. The Starting Conditions chapter also contains some generic advice on the starting power level and range of abilities. Chapter 2 is titled Mind Games. This chapter is devoted to how psionics affect the setting. Yet again, this is all generic advice that applies not only to Psis, but also to stuff like mages or superheroes or whatever. It talks about such things as how many Psis are there in the world, the public awareness of them, and most importantly, the public reaction. Are people with powers feared, accepted, or deferred? There is also a lot of information about various campaign frameworks centered around psionic powers. Chapter 3 is titled Unique Challenges. This is a great chapter that contains both useful generic advice and some crunch. First of all, we have a new limitation, easily resisted, and a new enhancement, cosmic, no rule of 16. There are also new modifiers for the easy to read disadvantage, psychic and psychic only. These are very flavorful modifiers that make you constantly project your thoughts and make your mind easier to read. The psionic short circuits contain some very valuable advice for dealing with abilities that may short-circuit your adventures, such as mind reading, remote senses, divination, mind control, undetectable attacks, invisibility, and healing. The Deterrence and Fixes chapter introduces some more generic ways to deal with psionic powers that get out of hand. In conclusion, I would again reiterate that this book probably didn't even need to exist. It should have been part of GURPS powers. The title is also a misnomer, because this book provides a lot of valuable advice on how to run games with any powers, not just psionic powers. Most of this advice is generic enough to be used when running games that do not even use GURPS as a system. So if you want to know what, for example, you should keep in mind when creating an adventure where one of the PCs is a mind control wizard, or a mage with divination spells, then you really should give this book a read. I hope that my ramblings here made sense to you, so thank you for watching and I'll see you next time.